You're listening to a Reformed Libertarians podcast bonus episode.
In this bonus episode, Gregory and I share our stories about how we became Reformed Libertarians. These were initially published on the LCI website and will include the text in the transcript. We already published them separately on the Reformed Libertarians podcast YouTube channel. But for anyone who hadn't read or listened to them yet, here they are together.
As you may know, Kerry Baldwin is not only co-host of this podcast, she's also an independent researcher and writer and an education entrepreneur. You can find excellent work from Kerry at her website, mereliberty.com. There, she challenges prevailing paradigms in politics, theology, and culture from a confessionally reformed, biblical, and philosophical perspective. Among other topics, she addresses abortion and views of womanhood. She's also principal educator and Socratic guide at Vita Nova Academy of Albuquerque, a learner-driven, mastery-based microschool with an emphasis in developing critical thinking and entrepreneurial skills. Here's Kerry's story.
From Lutheran Republican to Reformed Libertarian by Kerry Baldwin. I was born and raised in Albuquerque, New Mexico, in a politically and theologically conservative home. I was baptized, catechized, and confirmed in faith at a local Missouri Synod Lutheran, LCMS, church. My mother, raised Irish Catholic, the only person I've known with a BA in home economics, was never interested in politics. But my father was, and his views shaped mine as I grew up. He was a Green Beret Vietnam veteran working for the Federal Department of Energy by the time I was born. He was more or less a constitutionalist, as he understood it, and a registered Republican. His major influences, as I recall, were Ronald Reagan, Barry Goldwater, and to a lesser extent, Pat Buchanan and Ross Perot. I was enamored by my father's sense of patriotism, duty to uphold the Constitution and America's founding principles, and distrust of the government. Among other things, he impressed on me the importance of not working for or depending upon the government insofar as it was possible. In my experience, Lutherans don't often have any sort of robust political theology. This may be because their view of God's two kingdoms, in conscience and external matters respectively, tends to separate politics from spiritual concerns. In any case, my parents were actively involved in both the fledgling homeschooling movement and pro-life activism. One of my dad's religious influences at the time was Francis Schaeffer, a Presbyterian minister who promoted the pro-life cause among conservative Protestants. My three brothers and I were homeschooled in our younger years before it was legal in New Mexico. We spent many field trips at the state legislature as my and several other parents worked to legalize it. Although in later years, I attended both Lutheran and government schools. I distinctly recall attending a number of pro-life events with my parents and brothers. What I took away from those experiences at the time were the religious and emotional appeals of the movement. The emotional appeal being the graphic nature of abortion. The main idea was that hearts and minds of those who supported abortion would be changed if they were exposed to the horrific reality of what abortion actually is. The religious appeal, at least among so-called evangelicals, seemed to be that Scripture alone is sufficient and effective to argue against abortion. I later came to the conclusion that, while both appeals have a certain degree of merit, they are ultimately naively reductionistic and therefore insufficient and ineffective in changing the social, political, and economic facts and beliefs that contribute to the legality and practice of abortion. In 1996, I followed the Clinton versus Dole U.S. presidential election, in which so-called partial birth abortion was specifically at issue. I turned 18 in 1999, just in time to vote in the Bush v. Gore election. Not yet recognizing the political theater that such elections are, I became engrossed in cable news about the drama. Meanwhile, I was enrolled at the University of New Mexico, UNM, in the fall of 1999. I intended to double major in medical lab science and political science because of my support for the pro-life cause. I was strengthened in my understanding that contemporary legal arguments for abortion had no basis in biology, the Constitution, or human rights. And I came to recognize how such arguments were erroneous attempts to separate personhood and rights from being human. While attending UNM, I was exposed to evangelical, non-denominational Baptist beliefs and worship through the Baptist Student Union. Some classmates there tried to persuade me that I wasn't actually a Christian if I didn't have a conscious conversion experience and hadn't been baptized as a professing believer. I was deeply shaken by this and sought out my Lutheran pastor to assuage my anxieties about whether I was saved. My Lutheran pastor did a good job of that, and that's all I wanted for the moment. He also gave me several introductory pamphlets that contrasted Lutheran and typical non-denominational beliefs on baptism and eschatology. It wasn't long before I had more questions. Regrettably, my questions weren't really answered. My pastor was still seeking merely to emotionally reassure me. Not finding the more theologically substantial answers I was then seeking, I eventually became discontent with the LCMS altogether. Over the next year or so, I tried to work full-time while fitting in college courses when I could, without much success. Motivated partly by a misplaced sense of patriotic duty following the 9/11 terrorist attacks in 2001, and partly by the prospect of medical lab education and job experience, I enlisted in the U.S. Air Force in the spring of 2003. I also got married that winter. By 2005, I was pregnant and accepted the offer of an honorable discharge. I took that option at 8 months pregnant and came home to New Mexico. While I was pregnant, the baptism question came up again. This time I wanted a more thorough understanding of what Scripture actually teaches. I wanted to be more confident in what I believed. Either I would baptize my infant son in the Lutheran Church, or I would become Baptist, raising my children as Baptists. However, mostly through exposure to the teaching of the Presbyterian minister R.C. Sproul, the next 2 years of study would unexpectedly lead me to the Reformed Presbyterian perspective. By the time I came to the Reformed view of baptism, I had already given birth to my first 2 children, born about a year apart, and I had them baptized in the LCMS in 2007. We were attending a non-denominational church at the time. The church was largely opposed to the Reformed faith, and I didn't yet know of any Reformed or Presbyterian churches in the area to join. 2007 was also the time running up to the 2008 housing crash. The GOP primary was in full swing, and, still a registered Republican, I had the first opportunity to vote in the presidential primary. But there were 13 candidates at one point, and I had no idea how to choose from among them. Knowing what I did about the Constitution, I reviewed its statements about the role of the executive. As I watched debates, heard candidates speak, and read their campaign platforms, I realized that among them all, only Ron Paul paid any attention to the Constitution. Listening to videos by former Libertarian Party presidential candidate Michael Bednarik, I learned more about the Constitution and Bill of Rights. I read Bednarik's book, Good to be King. He explained that property tax was renting from the state property you owned, and that a driver's license was a grant of permission to use your own car. This perspective was paradigm shifting for me. I decided to vote for Ron Paul, but ultimately couldn't. He dropped out before the primaries reached New Mexico. Instead, I voted for Chuck Baldwin, no relation, of the Constitution Party. I voted once more for president in 2012 for Gary Johnson of the Libertarian Party. I haven't voted for a presidential candidate since, though I will still vote on referendums. In the following 4 years, I experienced 2 parallel journeys, one towards full-fledged libertarianism and the other towards full-fledged Reformed theology. In 2012, we left the non-denominational church we had been attending. After considering several supposed Presbyterian congregations, we began attending a small Orthodox Presbyterian church, OPC. That year, I started MereLiberty.com with the goal of challenging the false paradigm of left versus right and of promoting a libertarian perspective. The housing crash and bailouts in 2008, the so-called Affordable Care Act in 2010, Ron Paul's second run for president in 2012, and all the GOP shenanigans increasingly disillusioned and radicalized me. I was primed for anarchism, but couldn't yet make that leap, mostly because of my misunderstanding Romans 13 and not seeing how non-monopolistic polycentric law was supposed to work. It's said that it takes only 6 months to become anarchist once you accept libertarianism. From 2008, it took me 8 more years. In the meantime, I was active in municipal politics, but I was ultimately disillusioned when I realized the city is also run by unelected people, namely the city manager and city attorney. In 2014, my family and I officially became members of the OPC, and by 2015, I completed my Bachelor's of Arts in Philosophy from Arizona State University. During these same years, I came to realize, belatedly, as is all too common among those who are abused, that my husband was abusive towards me and our children, verbally, emotionally, and financially. He never took responsibility or expressed remorse for his mistreatment and fits of rage. When confronted by our pastor, he refused to listen. The elders of our church supported my decision to divorce in 2016. Later that year, in a Reformed Libertarian online discussion group, a friend asked me what my remaining objections were to Libertarian-Anarchism. Before the year was over, I had been introduced to the writings of economists Ludwig von Mises and Murray Rothbard. Especially Rothbard's anarchist political philosophy and a better understanding of the confessionally reformed view of Romans 13 resolved my objections. In many ways, my parallel developments in theological and political understanding dovetailed, and I became a convinced reformed libertarian anarchist. My understanding of our God-given self-ownership, property rights, and corresponding obligation of non-aggression resulted in the consistent conclusion that monopoly states are inherent aggressors and so illegitimate. I began to understand more clearly how non-monopolistic civil governance is both prescriptively ordained by God and a realistic possibility, even or especially in sinful human society. At the end of this essay, along with several other resources, is a playlist of episodes addressing our answers to minarchist objections. It explains some of the key points that persuaded me of libertarian anarchism. It wasn't until I became aware of Jeff Durbin, a Baptist pastor, and the abortion abolition movement sometime in 2016, that I would take up the pro-life defense again. I published a libertarian critique of prominent pro-life and pro-choice views. On the pro-life side, I pointed out that the lack of economic understanding contributed to addressing abortion in an overly narrow and reductionistic way. On the pro-choice side, I pointed out that the broader leftist appeal to protecting marginalized groups was fundamentally undermined by their own arguments favoring abortion. In 2019, I published a 2-part episode attempting to articulate fetal rights in terms of self-ownership. I was invited to debate Walter Block on his evictionist position at the Soho Forum. In 2020, most states around the world began implementing lockdowns and other disastrous measures in response to COVID. The policies of the New Mexico governor were especially tyrannical in prohibiting gatherings and mandating business closures, masking, and pushing vaccinations. When she could no longer keep people away from church, she mandated worshipers not to sing or take the Lord's Supper. She would make frequent public addresses that were fear-mongering and threatening. The parallels between abusive personal relationships and the inherent tyranny of the state became more apparent than ever. Not only do states depend on aggression, but also mass psychological manipulation and financial control to perpetuate their abuse. That same year, I began collaborating with my co-host, Gregory Baus, on developing the Reformed Libertarians podcast. Recognizing the tremendous need, we committed ourselves to promoting an understanding of libertarian anarchism grounded in a distinctively reformed faith and worldview. And by late 2022, we began publishing episodes with the Christians for Liberty Network through the Libertarian Christian Institute. Since 2020, a lot of libertarians I've known online abandoned libertarianism entirely. The lockdowns and other leftist policies in government and its crony institutions were enough for them to oppose non-aggression as a practical principle. They went full post-libertarian and began promoting a status strategy on behalf of supposed traditional values. They believe their re-embrace of violence and authoritarianism is putting away the childish things of libertarian principles. If anything, such post-libertarians only reveal that they themselves held to certain ideas childishly. However, I remain fully convinced of what we at Reformed Libertarians call the Boiti option. As we explain in Episode 8, the Boiti option is a strategy of the peaceful underthrow of the state. It's an active strategy of educating a critical mass of the population towards withdrawal of compliance with the state's tyranny. A critical mass need not be a majority. It is the smallest number required to sustain a chain reaction. It may be that the promulgation and widespread embrace of Christianity is requisite to achieving a more just and free society, but that will only be hindered and cannot be helped by the use of aggression. In any case, I'm devoted to the propagation of the confessionally reformed faith and church because I'm convinced it's the most faithful expression of biblical Christianity. I also believe Reformed Christianity provides the truest and most robust grounds for understanding all of human life as God has revealed it to be, whether political normativity or how we should oppose abuse in other societal spheres. I pray that others will join us as we promote these things through the Reformed Libertarians podcast. And now, about Gregory Baus. Beside his being co-host of this podcast, he's also an independent researcher and writer in philosophy. Among his primary interests are developing and promoting the neo-Calvinist philosophy of Herman Dooyeweerd and the Reformed covenant theology of Meredith Kline. Here is Gregory's story.
How I Became a Reformed Christian Libertarian-Anarchist by Gregory Baus. Unlike religion, politics was not a consciously prominent feature of my childhood. Nevertheless, without much reflection, I absorbed the political attitudes and opinions of my parents. In the home of my youth, from my birth in the early 70s through the 80s, it was largely treated as a given that the less government interference in society, particularly in the economy, the better. A central idea was that the United States federal government had gone fundamentally astray during FDR's administration, 1933 to 1945, with its economic interventionism. Constitutionally conservative political reform was necessary to restore the republic and to defeat domestic commies and all their pinko enablers. All this was obvious, so it seemed at the time, and so I didn't think about it much. However, in high school, I took up the anti-abortion cause, handing out pro-life pregnancy center info and evangelizing outside murder clinics and so on. In my own minority religious community and in the broader Christian community, abortion was considered, not wrongly, if myopically, the great societal evil of our day. Whatever the immorality of economic interventionism, legally permitting the mass slaughter of babies was a greater crisis, comparable to the enormity of Southern slavery, but worse. This was my political awakening, and in a striking way, it brought personal and societal morality, politics, religion, and science all together in a heady and revolutionary mixture. Abortion, or the anti-abortion cause, became a force that dragged me deep into my own religion and its civilizationally significant philosophical meaning. The minority religious community in which I was raised, largely in Baltimore, Maryland, was the Orthodox Presbyterian Church, within the camp of traditional confessionally reformed churches in the U.S. and Canada. The Reformed religion was once held by a majority of Americans from colonial times until the early 1800s. However, today, there are only about 500,000 of us. That's less than 0.15 of 1% of the U.S. population. There are about as many Amish and Old Order Mennonites in the U.S. as there are confessionally reformed Christians. Despite our vanishingly small numbers, we possess a rich and fruitful devotional and intellectual religious heritage. And it was this religious heritage that I came to embrace consciously and fervently in my teen years, and that deeply shaped my philosophical and political development. For those interested in an introduction to this form of Christianity, see recommended readings at the end of this essay. During high school, I read a number of Reformed theological classics and books by more recent Reformed thinkers. Among the more recent, I read several books by Francis Schaeffer, who significantly helped build the pro-life movement among conservative Protestants. I was particularly inspired by his book, The God Who Is There, and by A Christian Manifesto. In Manifesto, one of the things that stood out to me was the confessionally reformed teaching on Romans 13, 1-7. The view of that passage, and others like it, such as 1 Peter 2, 13-17, held by the majority of reformers, was that God only prescriptively ordains civil governance to use the sword or coercion against wrongdoing. When those who claim civil power create and enforce laws that do otherwise than punish actual wrongdoing, then they are unjust and tyrannical, and no one is required to submit to unjust or tyrannical power. Schaeffer particularly highlights the book Lex Rex by Samuel Rutherford, who said, for example, while civil rulers act against God's law and all good laws of men, they do not the things that appertain to their charge and the execution of their office. Therefore, by our confession, to resist them in tyrannical acts is not to resist the ordinance of God. The year after high school, I took a gap year of teaching English in Japan. Besides exposing me to a substantially unfamiliar culture and social context, strange beliefs, values, institutions, and customs, and so broadening my sense of human experience, it gave me an opportunity to reflect on the meaning and significance of religious belief for history. That year, one book that shaped my reflections was The Two Empires in Japan by John M. L. Young. This book helpfully recounts the history of conflict between a largely compromised Christianity with the predominant Shinto fascist nationalism in Japan. My first year in college, at a reformed liberal arts school in Georgia, when I was old enough to vote, I met and conversed with a visiting speaker on campus, Howard Phillips. He convinced me of the crucial importance of the 10th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution and the political philosophy of strictly limited government, classical liberalism, that served as its foundation. I became a member of the political party of which he was a key founder, which came to be known as the Constitution Party. I wasn't really politically active. However, believing that the U.S. government, not to mention most, if not all, local and particular state governments, as a matter of established policy, persistently violated the supposed rule of law, and so was in practice, if not in principle, illegitimate, provided plenty of opportunity to share my increasingly anti-government views. In the years following, I began to realize that the U.S. government had not only started to go wrong with FDR, but progressively violated its own constitution and the principles of liberty from the beginning. For example, see the Whiskey Rebellion from 1791 to 1794. And that the Constitution itself was an unlawful power grab against which the Anti-Federalists had warned. In college, I also read and was strongly influenced by the writings of neo-Calvinist theologians Abraham Kuyper, particularly his famous lectures on Calvinism as a worldview, and Meredith G. Kline, particularly his book Kingdom Prologue. I also discovered the writings of neo-Calvinist or reformational philosophers Herman Dooyeweerd, for example, his book Roots of Western Culture, among others, and Roy Clauser, and his book The Myth of Religious Neutrality that superbly explains key elements of Dooyeweerd's philosophy. These and other writings that articulated a reformed worldview, a view of redemptive historical, reformed covenant theology and scripture, and a reformed philosophical view of the basic nature of reality continue to represent the biblical and theoretical perspectives from which I view life, religion, culture, society, and politics. My fourth year of college, I took only one semester and another single semester in a fifth year. Then I dropped out of school in 1997, not having finished my bachelor's, feeling frustrated and disillusioned with, among many other things, the college's inability to provide deeper instruction in Dooyeweerd's philosophy. After 5 difficult years of working numerous odd jobs and personal struggle, with a 2-year sojourn in Southern California where I also audited some evening courses at a reformed seminary, I was able to enroll for a final year at a different Reformed liberal arts college in Ontario, Canada, that had a much stronger emphasis in Dooyeweerd's philosophy, and finished my BA. The infamous 9/11 attacks had occurred only a few years before, and the U.S. government's tyrannical response in the so-called Patriot Act and unjust invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq served to thoroughly undermine what remained of any naive benefit of the doubt assumptions I had concerning the state's supposed interest in protecting and promoting liberty and justice in domestic and foreign affairs. Around 2003, I also became aware of Ron Paul, a medical doctor who at the time was a U.S. representative for the 14th Congressional District in Texas that covered a coastal area southeast of Houston. Mostly through a friend who worked in his D.C. office, I became familiar with Paul's longtime solitary effort in the federal Congress, standing for actual constitutional limits on government and for the political and economic liberty envisioned by many of the U.S. founders. 2 years later, I enrolled at the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam in a philosophy master's program. In the year and a half I studied there, I focused on the philosophy of Herman Dooyeweerd, who had been a professor at that university from 1926 to 1965. I especially focused on his so-called transcendental critique of theoretical thought, political and social philosophy, and theory of what is called societal sphere sovereignty. Better understanding Dooyeweerd's view of sphere sovereignty, a theory of the normative natures of and relations between distinct kinds of societal communities, significantly contributed to my eventual conversion to full-fledged libertarian anarchism. However, during that same period, I also began an independent study in economics. Through my acquaintance with the efforts of Ron Paul, I became aware of the Mises Institute, a research and educational nonprofit dedicated to promoting, among other things, understanding of the Austrian School of Economics. I found a large quantity of academic resources from the Mises Institute for my independent study. I became persuaded of an Austrian view of praxeology, the study of necessary preconditions for human action, its premise of methodological individualism, the importance of these for a proper understanding of economics, and a thoroughgoing free market view. The central idea of methodological individualism is that only individuals intentionally or purposefully act, and this fact is not at odds or in tension with ideas important to sphere sovereignty, such as the reality of communities that cannot be reduced to inter-individual relations and a non-individualistic conception of society. Worth mentioning here is that my study in economics and praxeology also led to discovery of ideas that significantly helped me understand other areas of Dooyeweerd's philosophy. Often enough, discoveries in one field of study, or even within a given school of thought, can illuminate problems or ideas in another. This is a fact I believe many Christian libertarians have discovered in recognizing the mutually supporting beliefs of their religion and political and economic views. My study in economics led me to the writings of Murray Rothbard, an Austrian economist and historian who also wrote on political theory. Two works crucial to my conversion to libertarian anarchism were Rothbard's books For a New Liberty and The Ethics of Liberty. Alongside those and many of Rothbard's other writings, I was also influenced significantly by articles and lectures by Roderick Long, who is a professor of philosophy at Auburn University. In particular, I was helped by Rothbard's Left and Right 40 Years Later, Libertarian-Anarchism, Responses to 10 Objections, and Long's 10-lecture series, Foundations of Libertarian Ethics. I remember very distinctly one day in October 2008, while listening to the final lecture of the Foundations series, An Anarchist Legal Order, the proverbial light turned on in my mind. It took a few months, as I remember, to get used to the idea that I was now a convinced anarchist. At first, I didn't dare admit it to anyone. The very notion seemed almost too shocking. even while I was fully persuaded of it. However, being able to see how the total rejection of aggression or the initiation of coercion and threat of it against another person and property, and therefore a total rejection of the monopoly state as an inherently unjust and illegitimate distortion of God's ordained civil governance, was not only entirely compatible with, but in fact supported by my religious and philosophical convictions, reassured me that, however shocking, it was right to hold to libertarian anarchism. A few years after becoming a libertarian anarchist, I moved outside the U.S. and taught English until mid-2018. During those years, I had begun sketching out how to articulate the Reformed religious perspective on libertarian anarchism. In 2019, my friend Kerry Baldwin and I had begun brainstorming about creating a podcast devoted to explaining and promoting our shared views. By the end of 2020, we had written the Reformed Libertarianism Statement and Principles, and in late 2022, we began recording episodes of the Reformed Libertarians podcast as part of the Christians for Liberty network. If you want to find out more about the Reformed faith, the Reformed view of libertarian anarchism, and why we believe them, you may find the podcast helpful. Politics, including libertarian anarchist politics, is by no means the solution to all of life's problems. And on this side of Christ's return in glory to judge the living and the dead, and to establish the new heavens and earth, even salvation doesn't solve all our personal and societal woes. Nevertheless, as those who trust in Christ alone for our salvation, growing in our knowledge of Him, we can also grow in our understanding of what the Christian faith means for our whole lives, including politics, in service to Him. The Lord doesn't promise that it gets better in this life, and that isn't our ultimate hope, but it is our great privilege and joy, insofar as we may, to work for a politics that is more in keeping with the ordinances He has revealed.
That's all for this bonus episode. Keep an eye out for our planned and, Lord willing, forthcoming Reformed Libertarians Q&A series, in which we discuss with the guest host prominent questions about the meaning of Reformed libertarianism.
Thanks for listening to the Reformed Libertarians podcast, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute with Kerry Baldwin and Gregory Baus.
See the website for each episode's show notes and sign up for our email list. Don't forget to rate and review Reformed Libertarians podcast on Apple Podcast or your favorite podcatcher. Find our email and social media on our contact page at reformedlibertarians.com.